Stand at the rusted gates of Lynnewood Hall on a gray November afternoon, when the Pennsylvania sky presses down like a shroud and the wind cuts through the bare trees that line the long-abandoned drive, and you can almost hear the whispers of what this place once was, what it promised to be, what it became instead, a monument not to the triumph of wealth but to its fragility, its hollowness, its ultimate inability to protect against the cruelest turns of fate. This mansion, this colossal 110-room palace rising from the earth like something conjured from a fever dream of grandeur, was built to house not just a family but an empire, not just art but ambition itself, and yet for decades it stood empty, rotting, its ballroom where 1,000 guests once waltzed now home to nothing but pigeons and decay, its swimming pool filled not with water but with rubble, its grand staircase leading nowhere but down into darkness, and if you listen closely enough, if you press your ear to those cold limestone walls, you might hear the story this building really wants to tell, not the fairy tale of the self-made man who rose from butcher's apprentice to titan of industry, not the romance of Gilded Age excess and European treasure shipped across the Atlantic to fill gallery after gallery, but the dark truth that lurks beneath every square foot of marble, every inch of gold leaf, every Rembrandt and Raphael that once hung in these halls, that this palace was built on blood and bribes, on the broken backs of workers whose names were never recorded, on political corruption so deep it poisoned an entire city, and that when the sea claimed two of the men meant to inherit all this glory on a cold April night in 1912, when the RMS Titanic slipped beneath the waves with George Widener and his son Harry trapped in its steel embrace, this house began to die too, slowly at first, then faster, then catastrophically, until it became what you see today. America's largest abandoned mansion, a carcass of dreams turned to nightmares, a place where wealth worth billions in today's dollars couldn't buy what mattered most, couldn't prevent tragedy, couldn't even ensure that the house itself would be remembered with anything but pity and horror. What dark truths about American wealth would these walls reveal if they could speak? What price was paid for this glitter, and by whom? What does it mean that the grandest private residence ever built in Pennsylvania, a house that cost $8 million in 1899, nearly $300 million in today's money, ended up as a haven for vandals, its priceless furnishings sold off piece by piece, its art collection scattered to museums, its very existence nearly erased from history? The answer is written in every crack in the plaster, every hole in the roof, every empty room that once blazed with electric light and now knows only shadows, and it's a story about the American dream at its most baroque and its most broken, about what happens when the pursuit of acceptance and legacy collides with the immovable fact that wealth cannot buy immunity from grief, cannot purchase protection from fate, cannot guarantee that anything you build will last beyond your own breath, and it begins not in this decaying palace but in a small butcher shop in Philadelphia's rough northern Liberties neighborhood in the 1850s, where a young German-American boy named Peter Orell Brown Widener learned his first lesson about how money really works in America, that it flows not to the righteous or the talented but to those willing to seize opportunity when it presents itself, no matter how blood-soaked that opportunity might be. Peter Widener's father Johannes was a German immigrant butcher, a man who worked 16-hour days in a shop that reeked of death and sawdust, and young Peter learned early that there were two kinds of people in this world, those who did the cutting and those who owned the shops, and he knew with diamond-hard certainty which side of that divide he intended to occupy. He was not a brilliant student, not particularly charming, not blessed with any of the qualities that the mythology of American success usually celebrates, but he had something more valuable than all of that. He had hunger, the kind that gnaws at you from the inside, that makes you willing to do things other men won't do, to make deals in back rooms, to shake hands with devils if the price is right. By age 17 he'd opened his own butcher shop, and by 21 he'd married Hannah Josephine Dunton, and he might have remained just another neighborhood tradesman, another forgotten name in Philadelphia's endless ledger of small lives, except that the country tore itself apart in 1861 and Peter Widener saw what most men didn't see, that war, for all its horror, was the greatest business opportunity of his generation. Through political connections he'd carefully cultivated, through friendships with the right ward bosses and city officials, through a willingness to pay bribes and kickbacks and whatever else was required, Widener secured a contract that would change his life forever, the right to supply mutton to all Union Army troops within 10 miles of Philadelphia. The money he made, $50,000, roughly $850,000 in today's currency, came from meat that was often questionable, sometimes rancid, delivered in quantities that didn't quite match the invoices, charged at prices inflated by his monopoly position, and it came from the bodies of young men who ate that meat before marching off to die at Gettysburg and Antietam and 100 other blood-soaked fields, but Widener never lost a moment's sleep over it because he understood something fundamental about the American system, that patriotism was for suckers, that the real winners in any war were those who supplied it, and that no one remembers how you made your first fortune as long as you make enough fortunes after it to buy respectability. He took that blood money, because that's what it was, make no mistake, it was money that came directly from the machinery of mass death, and he invested it not in more butcher shops but in something far more lucrative, the future of urban transportation, the streetcar lines that would transform American cities and make a handful of men richer than kings. The Philadelphia of the 1870s and 80s was a city being remade by iron and steam, a place where the old walking city was giving way to something vast and sprawling, where people needed to move farther and faster than their feet could carry them, and the men who controlled that movement controlled everything. Widener understood this instinctively, the way a shark understands blood in the water, and he began buying up streetcar franchises, first one line, then another, then 10, then 50, until he and his partner William Lukens Elkins, another man who'd made his first fortune in ethically dubious ways, controlled virtually all public transportation in Philadelphia through their company, the Philadelphia Traction Company. But control wasn't enough, they wanted monopoly, the kind of absolute dominance that lets you set prices however high you want, that lets you run dangerous overcrowded cars because there's no competition to force you to do better, and to achieve that monopoly they needed something money alone couldn't buy. They needed the Philadelphia city government in their pocket, every councilman, every supervisor, every judge who might rule against them, every newspaper editor who might write unfavorably about their business practices. So they built a machine, a political apparatus so sophisticated and so corrupt that it would become legendary, a system where votes were bought in bulk, where elections were rigged with scientific precision, where anyone who opposed them found their businesses mysteriously burned, their reputations destroyed, their careers ended. The journalist Lincoln Steffens, who investigated urban corruption for McClure's magazine, would later write that Philadelphia was corrupt and contented, a city so thoroughly owned by men like Widener that it had given up even pretending to have a functioning democracy. And at the center of that corruption, pulling the strings, collecting the bribes, distributing the payoffs, was Peter Widener, a man who'd learned that the only thing better than being rich was being powerful, and that true power came not from making money but from controlling the systems through which money flowed. His streetcar empire expanded beyond Philadelphia to New York, Chicago, Baltimore, his fingers in so many pies that by the 1890s he was worth somewhere between $50 and $100 million, as much as $5 billion in today's money. And he'd become exactly what he'd dreamed of as a boy in his father's butcher shop, one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America, a name spoken in the same breath as Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan, and yet there was a problem, a fundamental crack. In the foundation of everything he'd built, a source of shame that no amount of money seemed able to fix, Philadelphia society, the old families with their Mayflower pedigrees and their main-line estates, refused to accept him, refused to acknowledge that money alone could buy you a seat at their table. And for all his millions, for all his power, Peter Widener was still, in their eyes, just a German butcher's son who'd made his fortune through corruption and graft, a man who might have money, but would never have class. This rejection burned in Widener like acid, ate at him through every successful deal and every profitable investment, because he believed the fundamental American promise, that in this new world, in this democracy, money was the only thing that mattered, that enough wealth would open every door, would let you reinvent yourself completely, would erase any taint of low birth or questionable dealings, and he'd discovered too late that the promise was a lie, that there were doors money alone couldn't open, that the old families of Philadelphia had a weapon against which even his millions were useless, taste, breeding, the ability to look at his mansion on North Broad Street with its conspicuous new wealth and pronounce it, with a barely concealed sneer, vulgar. So Widener decided to build something so magnificent, so overwhelming in its grandeur, so obviously expensive and European and cultured that no one, not even the most snobbish mainline matron, could possibly call it vulgar, something that would force acceptance through sheer architectural intimidation. And in 1897 he purchased 300 acres in the newly developed suburb of Elkins Park, named for his business partner, and he hired the most talented young architect in Philadelphia, a man named Horace Trumbauer who'd made his name designing houses for the nouveau riche and who understood exactly what Widener wanted, not just a house but a statement, not just a home but a palace that would rival anything in Europe, that would make every mansion on the main line look like a cottage by comparison. Trumbauer drew his inspiration from English country estates, from Prior Park in Bath and Ballingery in New Jersey, and he designed a neoclassical revival mansion so vast, so perfectly proportioned, so classically correct that it looked like it had been transported whole from Derbyshire or Kent, a house that would contain not just rooms but entire wings, not just paintings but entire galleries, not just a library but a temple to learning that would shame most universities, and the message was clear, brutally clear: look at me, look at what I've built, and dare to call me vulgar now, dare to suggest that money can't buy culture, dare to claim that you, with your inherited name and your mortgaged estate, are somehow my superior. Construction began in 1897, and for 2 years Elkins Park was transformed into something like a medieval building site, hundreds of workers swarming over the property, stone masons and carpenters and plasterers and electricians, most of them immigrants, Irish and Italian and Polish men who worked 12, 14, 16-hour days in conditions that killed several of them, though their names were never recorded because men like that were replaceable, because Widener was in a hurry and dead. Workers simply meant more workers were hired to take their place, because the mansion had to be ready by 1899, had to be perfect, had to be overwhelming. The house that rose from that earth was a monster of limestone and marble, 70,000 square feet spread across 110 rooms, and those numbers barely begin to convey the reality of the place. There were 55 bedrooms, because Widener intended to host weekend parties that would rival anything in England, 20 bathrooms with the latest plumbing technology shipped from Europe, a ballroom that could accommodate 1,000 guests with room to spare for dancing, an art gallery that was essentially a private museum with specially designed lighting and climate control, a swimming pool in the basement, wine cellars that could store thousands of bottles, a private power plant because the local electrical grid couldn't handle the mansion's needs, greenhouses and stables and kennels and a polo field, and every single inch of the place was finished to a standard of luxury that most Americans couldn't even imagine, with marble imported from Carrara, wood paneling from French chateaux, crystal chandeliers from Venice, silk wallpapers from Lyon, and a staff of more than 100 servants whose entire lives were dedicated to keeping the machine of Lynnewood Hall running smoothly. That staff, the butlers and footmen and maids and cooks and laundresses and gardeners and stable boys, lived in the warren of rooms on the upper floors and in the basement, in spaces that were not luxurious, that were in fact cramped and hot in summer and freezing in winter, that had none of the amenities the family enjoyed, because the whole architecture of the house was designed to keep them invisible, to create the illusion that the mansion ran itself, that food appeared on tables and clothes got cleaned and fires got lit through some kind of magic rather than through the labor of people who worked 16-hour days for wages that kept them just barely above poverty, people whose names Widener didn't know and didn't care to learn because they were, in his view, simply part of the machinery of the house, as interchangeable as the coal that fed the furnaces. But if you want to understand what Lynnewood Hall really was, if you want to grasp the true nature of what Widener built, you have to understand the art collection, because that was the real point. That was the weapon he was forging against Philadelphia society's rejection. Starting in the 1880s and accelerating after the house was built, Widener became one of the most aggressive collectors of European art in America, competing with J.P. Morgan and Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Carnegie in a Gilded Age arms race where the prize was cultural legitimacy and the ammunition was old master paintings, and Widener bought with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, spending money that would make your head spin, $500,000 for a single Rembrandt, the equivalent of nearly $18 million today, and that was just one painting among hundreds. He assembled one of the finest private collections of art ever seen in America, Rembrandts and Raphaels and Van Dycks and Vermeers, works by every major European master, each one purchased through dealers like Joseph Devine who understood that these American millionaires weren't really buying art, they were buying history, buying culture, buying proof that they belonged in the same conversation as the aristocrats who'd owned these paintings for centuries. Widener installed his treasures in the specially designed gallery at Lynnewood Hall, a space that rivaled many European museums, and he opened the collection to the public, or at least to the right kind of public, to the people whose approval he so desperately craved, because he understood that the collection itself was only half the point, the other half was making sure everyone knew he had it, making sure that when people thought of Peter Widener they thought not of the butcher shop or the political corruption or the streetcar monopoly but of Rembrandt and Raphael, of culture and refinement and taste, and in this, at least, he succeeded, because by the early 1900s even the snobbishest Philadelphia families couldn't deny that the collection at Lynnewood Hall was extraordinary, couldn't avoid inviting Peter Widener to their parties and accepting invitations to his, couldn't maintain the fiction that money alone didn't matter when it could buy literally all of Europe's greatest artistic heritage and display it in a house that looked like it had been standing since the Renaissance. Widener filled his palace not just with art but with family, with the people for whom all this effort was supposedly undertaken, though if you looked closely you might notice how little time he actually spent with them, how much of his life was still consumed by business, by the endless machinations required to maintain and expand his empire. He'd married Hannah Josephine Dunton back in 1855, and she'd given him two sons who couldn't have been more different, George Dunton Widener, born in 1861, who grew into a man much like his father, aggressive and business-minded, who married Eleanor Elkins, daughter of Peter's business partner, and who seemed destined to inherit and expand the family empire, and Joseph Early Widener, born in 1872, who was more interested in horses and art than in streetcars and politics, who preferred Newport to Philadelphia, who would eventually marry Ella Pancoast and become a gentleman collector rather than a titan of industry. George had 3 children of his own: Harry Elkins Widener, born in 1885, who developed a passion for rare books and who graduated from Harvard with a collection that already rivaled many university libraries; George Dunton Widener Jr., born in 1889, and Eleanor Widener, born in 1891. These were the people for whom Lynnewood Hall existed, the inheritors of everything Peter had built, the justification for all the corruption and exploitation and ruthless dealing, because isn't that what we always tell ourselves about the pursuit of wealth, that it's for the family, for the next generation, that we're building something that will outlast us and provide security and comfort for our children and our children's children? This is the story American capitalism tells itself in the mirror every morning, the narrative that transforms greed into nobility. But what happened next would expose that narrative for the lie it always was, would demonstrate with brutal clarity that wealth cannot protect the people you love, that money is no defense against tragedy, that all the art and all the marble and all the carefully cultivated taste in the world mean nothing when fate decides to collect its debt. In April of 1912, George Widener and his wife Eleanor and their son Harry were in Europe, one of those extended grand tours that the American wealthy took to prove their sophistication, to buy art and furniture and anything else that might enhance their position back home, and they were traveling in the highest possible style, because George had inherited his father's understanding that appearance mattered, that you had to live in a way that demonstrated your place in the world. They'd been in Paris, where Harry had found a rare 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's Essays at a bookshop, had paid a fortune for it and was giddy with the acquisition, and now they were returning home, had booked passage on a new ship, the largest and most luxurious vessel ever built, a floating palace called the RMS Titanic that was making its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. And if you wanted to demonstrate your wealth and position in 1912, if you wanted to be seen in the right company, there was Northwest better place to do it than in first class on the Titanic, surrounded by other millionaires, by the Astors and Guggenheims and Strasses, by the people who mattered in that gilded world. George Widener was so confident, Southwest certain of his place and his safety, that on April 14th, the 4th night of the voyage, he and Eleanor hosted a dinner party in the ship's a la carte restaurant, inviting Captain Edward Smith and several other first-class passengers for a meal that must have been spectacular, with champagne and caviar and multiple courses, with the finest wine and the best conversation, and no one at that table had any idea that they were eating their last meal, that in just a few hours the Titanic would strike an iceberg, that the ship everyone said was unsinkable would sink anyway, would go down with such shocking speed that most of the people aboard wouldn't have time to process what was happening, wouldn't be able to believe that this palace of steel and luxury could simply vanish beneath the waves. When the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., when the crew began to understand how bad the damage was, when it became clear that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, the rules of the Gilded Age reasserted themselves with a vengeance: women and children first, but really it was first-class women and children first, because steerage passengers found the gates to the upper decks locked, found themselves trapped below as the ship filled with water, and even among the first class, there was a hierarchy, a brutal calculus about who deserved to be saved. Eleanor Widener made it into a lifeboat, was pulled away from the sinking ship and spent the night on the freezing Atlantic surrounded by the screams of the dying, and she survived, but George stayed behind, stayed with the men, stayed because that's what gentlemen did, what honor demanded, and Harry stayed too, stayed with his father, and they were last seen standing on the deck as the ship's bow plunged underwater, as the stern lifted impossibly high into the air, and then the ship broke in half and slid beneath the surface and they were gone, both of them, drowned in water so cold it killed in minutes. And if Harry was holding his precious Bacon Essays when he died, if he was thinking about the library he'd been planning to build at Harvard, if he had any final thoughts at all, we'll never know because the ocean keeps its secrets, tells nothing, returns nothing. And all Eleanor Widener got back was her own grief and the knowledge that she'd survived when her son and husband had not. Word reached Peter Widener at Lynnewood Hall on April 15th, reached him in his palace surrounded by his Rembrandts and his marble and his perfectly manicured grounds, reached him in the house he'd built to prove that money could buy anything, could solve any problem, could ensure any outcome, and the message was simple and devastating. 2 of the people he'd built all this for were dead, were gone, were never coming home, and there was nothing his billions could do about it, no amount of money that could bribe or cajole or purchase their way back from the bottom of the Atlantic, because in the end wealth only has power over the things wealth can influence, and death doesn't care what you're worth, doesn't check your bank balance before it takes you, treats the millionaire and the steerage passenger with exactly the same indifference. The deaths of George and Harry Widener broke something in Lynnewood Hall that could never be repaired, cracked the foundation of the house as surely as if the stone itself had split, because a mansion like this isn't just a building, it's a story about the future, about legacy, about the line continuing, and that story had just been torn to pieces. Peter Widener, who'd always been hard and pragmatic and unsentimental in business, became something else after the Titanic, became a ghost of himself, wandering his palace like a man looking for something he'd lost, and what he'd lost wasn't just his son and grandson but the entire point of everything he'd built, the justification for all those years of corruption and exploitation and ruthless dealing, because what did any of it matter now? What was the point of the art collection if George wasn't there to inherit it? What was the point of the 110 rooms if they'd never echo with Harry's grandchildren's laughter? What was the point of building an empire if the empire had no heir? Eleanor Widener, Harry's mother, who'd survived the sinking, channeled her grief into something productive, something that would memorialize her son. She donated $3.5 million to Harvard to build Widener Library, the largest university library in the world, a memorial in stone and books to the son who'd loved collecting, who dreamed of building his own library, who died with a rare book in his hands. And the library still stands today, still bears Harry's name, still serves as a monument to a young man who had everything except time. But Peter Widener had no such outlet, no way to transform his grief into something useful, and he simply withdrew, spent his final years at Lynnewood Hall increasingly isolated, increasingly bitter, watching as his body failed him, as his health declined, as everything he'd built revealed itself to be temporary, fragile, subject to the same decay that claims everything human beings create. He died on November 6, 1915, at the age of 80, died in the house he'd built to prove his worth, surrounded by art that no longer meant anything to him, and the question that must have haunted his final days was the question that haunts all of us eventually: what was it for? What did any of it mean? What remains when everything you built outlives its purpose? Joseph Widener inherited Lynnewood Hall, inherited the entire empire his father and brother had built, became sole heir to a fortune that made him one of the richest men in America, but he didn't want any of it, not really, because Joseph had never been Peter, had never had that hunger, that drive to dominate and control, had always preferred the life of a gentleman to the life of a titan. He kept the art collection, even expanded it, because art at least made sense to him in a way that streetcars and politics never had, and he continued his father's practice of lending paintings to exhibitions, of allowing scholars to study the collection, because he understood that the art itself was the one thing of value his family had created, the one legacy worth preserving. But Lynnewood Hall itself was a burden, a vast expense that required an army of servants and constant maintenance, a house built for a family and a future that no longer existed, and Joseph and his wife Ella and their children, Peter A.B. Widener II and Josephine, never quite filled it, never managed to make it feel like a home rather than a mausoleum, because you can't heat 110 rooms with love, can't fill 70,000 square feet with just 4 or 5 people, and every empty bedroom, every unused gallery, every silent hallway seemed to echo with the ghosts of the people who should have been there, George and Harry and all the generations that were supposed to follow. The Titanic had killed not just 2 men but the entire future Peter Widener had imagined, had murdered the dynasty before it could even properly begin, and Lynnewood Hall stood as a monument to that murdered future, to dreams that died in cold Atlantic water. Joseph tried to maintain the place through the 1920s and 30s, tried to keep up appearances, but the world was changing, the Gilded Age was over, the Great Depression made conspicuous consumption seem not just distasteful but obscene, and servants were getting harder to find, were demanding better wages and better treatment, were no longer willing to spend their lives in the basement and attic rooms of houses like this for the privilege of serving the wealthy. The maintenance costs were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars every year just to keep the roof from leaking, the pipes from freezing, the grounds from reverting to wilderness, and for what? For a house that no one really lived in, that served no real purpose except as a storage facility for paintings that belonged in museums. Joseph Widener made a decision that his father would have considered unthinkable, a decision that represented the final abandonment of Peter's dream of dynastic permanence. In 1939, he announced that he was donating the entire art collection, more than 2,000 pieces including paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, and decorative objects, to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the newly established museum that was meant to be America's Louvre, the place where the nation's greatest art treasures would be preserved for the public. The donation, finalized between 1940 and 1942, included some of the most valuable works in private hands: Rembrandt's The Mill, Raphael's Alba Madonna, works by Vermeer and Van Dyck and Titian and every other master his father had so obsessively collected, works worth tens of millions even then, worth hundreds of millions today, and Joseph gave them all away, kept nothing for himself, because he understood something his father never had, that trying to hold on to all this, trying to keep it private and personal and owned, was a losing game, that time and decay and the inevitable dissolution of families meant that eventually everything gets dispersed anyway, and it was better to do it on your terms, to ensure the collection stayed together, to let the public benefit from what his father had assembled. The gift transformed the National Gallery overnight, made it one of the world's great museums, and it was without question the best thing the Widener family ever did, the one act that justified all the rest of it, that transformed the tainted money from streetcar corruption and Civil War profiteering into something of lasting cultural value, but it also marked the end of Lynnewood Hall's purpose, because once the art was gone, once the paintings were crated up and shipped to Washington, once the galleries were bare and the walls were empty, what was left? Just a very large, very expensive house that no one particularly wanted, in a suburb that had developed around it, surrounded by middle-class families who found the whole place faintly ridiculous, this palace from another era just sitting there like a beached whale, magnificent and useless and slowly dying. Joseph Widener died in 1943, and his will revealed the extent to which the family fortune had been depleted, not by poverty, they were still wealthy by any normal standard, but the days of being competitive with Carnegie and Rockefeller were long over, the streetcar empire had been sold off or devalued by the rise of automobiles. The investments had been liquidated to pay for the art donations and the estate taxes and the endless maintenance on properties that no longer generated enough income to justify their existence. His son, Peter A.B. Widener II, inherited Lynnewood Hall, inherited the burden of the place, and he took one look at this 110-room monster and made the only sensible decision: he wanted nothing to do with it. He lived in the mansion briefly, tried to figure out what to do with it, but by the late 1940s it was clear that the age of houses like Lynnewood Hall was over, that America had moved on, that no one in the modern world wanted to live in a place that required 100 servants and cost a fortune just to heat through one Pennsylvania winter, that the whole concept of the Gilded Age palace had become as outdated as horse-drawn carriages and gas lighting. Peter A.B. Widener II put Lynnewood Hall on the market, and it sat there, and sat there, and sat there, because who in their right mind would buy a house like that? Who had the money and the staff and the desire to maintain such an absurdly large property? Movie stars wanted Beverly Hills mansions, not moldering Pennsylvania estates. New millionaires wanted penthouses in Manhattan, not neoclassical palaces in the suburbs, and the old families who might once have appreciated such a house were themselves struggling to maintain their own estates, were selling off land and converting stables into apartments and doing everything they could to survive the changing economy that had made their way of life obsolete. The house stayed on the market through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, growing more dilapidated with each passing year, because Peter wasn't spending money to maintain a property he was desperate to sell, and the few people who toured the place came away either depressed by its grandeur or horrified by the costs of restoration, and so Lynnewood Hall stood empty, the windows broken by vandals, the copper stolen from the roof, the grounds overgrown, the swimming pool filling with debris. And locals began to tell stories about the place, about how it was haunted by the Widener men who died on the Titanic, about how you could hear their ghosts wandering the empty corridors at night, about how the house itself was cursed, because how else do you explain a palace this magnificent falling into such complete abandonment? The truth was simpler and more prosaic. Lynnewood Hall was abandoned because it had outlived its time, because the society that had made such houses possible and desirable had dissolved, because the machinery of servants and the economics of vast inherited wealth and the social structures that supported all of it had collapsed, and what was left was just a building, just stone and marble and wood, and none of it meant anything anymore without the context that had created it. Finally, in 1952, Peter A.B. Widener II found a buyer, though not the kind anyone might have hoped for, the Reverend Carl McIntyre, a fundamentalist preacher who wanted to use the property for his faith theological seminary, a Bible college that needed space for classrooms and dormitories and offices, and McIntyre paid $190,000 for the house and grounds, a tiny fraction of what it had cost to build, an insulting sum that demonstrated just how far Lynnewood Hall had fallen, but Peter didn't care. Because he was just glad to be rid of the burden, glad to close the chapter of his family's history, glad to never have to think about the place again. Carl McIntyre's purchase of Lynnewood Hall in 1952 should have been the beginning of a new chapter, a story of redemption and adaptive reuse, of a magnificent building finding new purpose in service of education and faith, but instead it was the beginning of the end, the start of a long slow decline that would transform America's most magnificent private residence into America's most notorious ruin. McIntyre and his faith theological seminary moved into the mansion, converted the bedrooms into dorm rooms, the ballroom into a chapel, the galleries into classrooms, and at first it might have seemed like it could work, like the house might survive after all, but there were problems immediately, fundamental incompatibilities between what the building was and what McIntyre needed it to be. The maintenance costs were staggering, far beyond what a small religious college could afford, and McIntyre didn't have Peter Widener's fortune to draw on, didn't have an army of servants and skilled craftsmen to keep every system functioning, so things started to break down, slowly at first, a leaking roof here, a broken window there, a heating system that only worked in half the building, but accelerating with each passing year because that's how old buildings die, gradually and then suddenly. Because once you stop maintaining them they deteriorate exponentially, each small failure leading to larger failures, water damage leading to structural damage leading to complete collapse. To raise money for operations, McIntyre's organization began selling off the remaining fixtures and furnishings that the Widener family had left behind, the things that were too large or too built-in to move easily, and piece by piece Lynnewood Hall was stripped, its marble mantles sold to antique dealers, its light fixtures removed and auctioned, its wood paneling pried from the walls, its stained glass windows extracted and shipped to collectors, and each loss made the house less valuable, less beautiful, less worth saving, until what remained was a shell, a carcass, a building that had been gutted of everything that made it special. The seminary struggled financially through the 1960s and 70s and 80s, never quite able to cover its costs, never quite able to maintain the building properly, and the students who lived there found themselves in rooms with leaking ceilings and broken windows and heating that worked sporadically if at all, found themselves in a building that seemed to be actively falling apart around them, and there was something almost darkly appropriate about it, about training ministers in a mansion built by robber barons, about trying to serve God in a house constructed through political corruption and worker exploitation, because maybe the decay itself was a sermon, a lesson about the transience of earthly glory, about what happens to every palace eventually. By the late 1990s, the seminary couldn't continue, couldn't afford to stay in the building any longer, couldn't keep pretending that the arrangement was viable, and they abandoned Lynnewood Hall, simply walked away and left it to rot, and for the next 2 decades the mansion existed in a strange limbo, technically owned by McIntyre's organization but actually belonging to no one, a massive empty building slowly collapsing in on itself while neighbors watched and real estate developers circled. And preservationists wrung their hands and did nothing. The vandalism got worse, the theft more systematic, because an abandoned building attracts scavengers the way a corpse attracts flies, and they stripped out everything of value that remained, the copper piping, the brass fixtures, the marble tiles, anything that could be sold for scrap or to antique dealers who didn't ask too many questions about provenance, and they left behind trash and graffiti and broken glass, left behind a mess that made the building even less salvageable, less valuable, less likely to be saved. Urban explorers discovered the place, broke in through the boarded windows and the broken doors, and they documented what they found: ballrooms filled with rubble, swimming pools filled with debris, grand staircases leading to collapsed ceilings, galleries where Rembrandts once hung now covered in graffiti and water stains, and they posted their photographs online and the images went viral, became part of the internet's endless fascination with beautiful ruins, with the aesthetics of decay, and Lynnewood Hall became famous again, but famous for all the wrong reasons, famous not for what it had been but for what it had become, famous as America's largest abandoned mansion, famous as a cautionary tale about what happens when we build too big, dream too large, assume that wealth will protect us from time and fate and the inevitable dissolution that claims everything human beings create. The photographs showed a building being reclaimed by nature, by entropy, showed how quickly a palace can become a ruin when no one maintains it, showed walls stained by water damage and floors covered in debris and ceilings collapsing and vegetation growing through the broken windows, and there was something almost beautiful about it. Something aesthetically compelling about the way nature and time were erasing Peter Widener's monument to human ambition, but it was the beauty of death, the beauty of endings, and anyone who looked at those photographs and felt anything other than profound sadness was missing the point, because this wasn't just a building falling apart, it was a story about American capitalism at its most naked and cruel, a story about what we build and why we build it and what it costs and what happens when the people and purposes that justified the building are gone. The question of what to do with Lynnewood Hall consumed Philadelphia's preservation community for years, sparked endless debates about whether the building could be saved, whether it should be saved, whether the costs of restoration, estimated at $20 to $30 million just for the first phase of stabilization and basic repairs, could possibly be justified when that money could be used for so many other purposes, and there was something almost obscene about the calculus, about discussing spending tens of millions to save a robber baron's mansion when there were people in Philadelphia who didn't have adequate housing or health care or schools, when the money Widener had made through corruption was still, in a sense, being extracted from the city, still demanding resources and attention and care long after his death. But preservationists argued, with some validity, that Lynnewood Hall was historically significant, that it represented an important period in American architecture and social history, that letting it collapse would mean losing forever a building that documented the Gilded Age in ways that no book or photograph could capture, and they were right, in a sense. Though right in a way that raised uncomfortable questions about whose history we choose to preserve, why we're so eager to save the palaces of the wealthy while letting the homes and neighborhoods of ordinary people get demolished for urban renewal and highway construction, why we memorialize the robber barons but forget the workers they exploited, the communities they destroyed, the democratic processes they corrupted. The building went on the market multiple times, with asking prices that kept dropping, $20 million, then $16 million, then less, but there were no buyers, no one willing to take on the enormous expense and responsibility, and Lynnewood Hall seemed destined for demolition, for the wrecking ball, for complete erasure from the landscape except as a memory and a cautionary tale. And maybe that would have been appropriate, maybe there would have been justice in letting Peter Widener's monument to himself be completely obliterated, returned to the earth, forgotten, because isn't that what happens to everything eventually? Isn't that the final truth that all our building and acquiring and accumulating runs up against, that we are temporary, our works are temporary, our legacies are temporary, and the universe doesn't care what we built or why we built it or what we thought it meant? But then something unexpected happened, something that might represent a different kind of ending, a possibility for redemption or at least for honest reckoning with what Lynnewood Hall actually represents. In 2023, after years of negotiations and fundraising and complex legal maneuvering, a nonprofit organization called the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation successfully purchased the property for $9 million, finally taking ownership of the mansion and committing to a long-term restoration project that would stabilize the building, repair the most critical damage, and eventually transform it into something new, not a private residence, because that era is over and everyone knows it, but a public space, a museum perhaps, an educational center, a place where people could come to learn about the Gilded Age and about the Widener family and about the broader questions of wealth and power and legacy that the house embodies, and most importantly, a place that would tell the whole story, not just the fairy tale of the self-made man and his magnificent art collection but the dark truth about where the money came from, about the corruption and exploitation and human costs that built every room and bought every painting, about the servants who lived their entire lives in the service corridors and basement rooms, about the workers who died building the place, about the political machine that made it all possible, about the Titanic and its aftermath, about the decades of abandonment and decay, about what it means that we're now spending millions to save a building that represents everything that was wrong with Gilded Age America, everything that was grotesque and unequal and unsustainable about that era, and the only way to justify saving it is to make it speak truth, to make it tell the stories it was built to hide, to transform it from a monument to success into a mirror that shows us what we'd prefer not to see about wealth and power and the American dream. The restoration work is ongoing, will take years, maybe decades, will require tens of millions of dollars and the efforts of craftspeople with skills that are increasingly rare, because building and maintaining a house like Lynnewood Hall requires knowledge that's no longer commonly taught, techniques that have been largely forgotten in our age of drywall and vinyl siding, and there's something poignant about that, about the fact that we're having to relearn how to save this palace from another era, having to reverse engineer the systems and methods that created it, because in our rush to modernize and simplify we've lost so much knowledge about how to build things that last, about how to create beauty that endures, even if that beauty was always tainted by the darkness of its origins. The Preservation Foundation's plan envisions not just restoration but reinterpretation, wants to use the house to explore uncomfortable questions about wealth and class and power, wants to bring in scholars and historians who can help excavate the hidden stories, the servants' narratives, the workers' experiences, the full complicated truth of what Lynnewood Hall was and is and represents, and if they succeed, if they can pull this off, it might be the most interesting historical site in America, a place that refuses to romanticize the Gilded Age, that insists on showing both the beauty and the horror, the grandeur and the cost, the dreams and the nightmares, and that uses the mansion itself as the primary document, the main text through which visitors can understand an entire era and its delusions and its brutalities and its legacy that we're still living with today. The foundation has begun offering limited tours, letting people see the building in its current state of partial restoration, and the tours are selling out, because there's clearly hunger for this kind of honest engagement with history, this kind of unflinching look at what our monuments actually mean, and the people who walk through those damaged rooms, who see the water-stained walls and collapsed ceilings alongside the magnificent architecture and the spaces where masterpieces once hung, come away changed, come away understanding something about wealth and permanence and the fragility of everything we build that they didn't understand before. But let's be honest about what's happening here, about what it means to save Lynnewood Hall, because there's something deeply strange, maybe even perverse, about spending millions of dollars to preserve a house that was built through corruption and exploitation, about turning a robber baron's palace into a tourist destination, about the fact that Peter Widener's name will now be preserved and remembered when the names of the workers who died building his mansion are lost forever, when the Streetcar conductors and the Civil War soldiers who suffered because of his profiteering are forgotten, when the Philadelphia voters whose democratic rights he purchased and destroyed are just statistics in history books, if they're mentioned at all. The preservation of Lynnewood Hall raises uncomfortable questions about whose stories we tell, whose buildings we save, who gets to be memorialized and who gets to be forgotten, and the answers to those questions reveal something fundamental about American society, that we are, even now, even with all our professed commitment to equality and justice, still dazzled by wealth, still impressed by grandeur, still willing to forgive almost anything if the person who did it was rich enough and the building they left behind is beautiful enough. Would we spend $30 million to preserve a row house where a factory worker raised 6 children? Would we mount a campaign to save a tenement building where immigrants live 12 to a room? Would we create a foundation and solicit donations and organize tours to memorialize the neighborhoods that were demolished to make way for Widener's streetcar lines, the communities that were destroyed by urban renewal projects funded by his political machine? We know the answer. We know we wouldn't, because those places aren't beautiful, aren't photogenic, don't inspire the aesthetic appreciation that makes preservation seem like a noble cause rather than a waste of resources, and so they disappear, get erased, leave no trace except perhaps a historical marker that most people walk past without reading, while Lynnewood Hall, with all its problematic history and its foundations built on corruption, gets saved and studied and celebrated. And yet, maybe there's value in preservation precisely because it allows us to have these conversations, to ask these questions, to look directly at a building like Lynnewood Hall and see both what it was meant to be and what it actually is, to refuse the easy narrative of Gilded Age glamour and insist instead on the full truth of where such places came from and what they cost and what they represent. Maybe the point isn't to celebrate the mansion but to study it, to use it as evidence, to let it testify about an era and a system and a set of values that created immense beauty alongside immense suffering, that built palaces on foundations of exploitation, that dreamed dreams of dynastic permanence that the universe conspired to destroy. Lynnewood Hall is a crime scene, in a sense, the scene of crimes both specific, the corruption, the worker deaths, the political manipulation, and general, the broader crime of a society that allowed such extreme inequality, that permitted a handful of men to accumulate wealth that nations might envy while millions lived in poverty, that created a system where your worth as a human being was determined almost entirely by your bank balance, where a butcher's son could become a titan through ruthless dealing and political bribery, where the acquisition of European art was treated as more culturally significant than the welfare of American workers. And like any crime scene, it should be preserved not to honor what happened there but to understand it, to learn from it, to ensure that we don't forget what humans are capable of when we organize our societies around the principle that wealth is the only thing that matters, that money is the measure of all value, that the purpose of life is accumulation and the purpose of accumulation is power. The story of Lynnewood Hall is the story of American capitalism told in stone and marble, a story that begins with blood money from Civil War meat contracts and ends with a decaying ruin that no one wants, and every chapter in between is about the pursuit of acceptance, the hunger for legitimacy, the desperate attempt to use wealth to purchase not just things but meaning, not just goods but identity, not just property but worth. Peter Widener built his palace to prove that he belonged, to force Philadelphia society to accept him, to demonstrate that a German butcher's son who'd made his fortune through corruption could transform himself into a cultured gentleman, could own Rembrandts and host weekend parties and live like European aristocracy, and in a sense he succeeded, achieved everything he'd set out to achieve, became one of the richest men in America, assembled one of the finest art collections ever seen in private hands, built a house that stunned everyone who saw it, but it didn't matter, none of it mattered, because the Atlantic Ocean doesn't care how rich you are, doesn't check your bank balance before it drowns your son and grandson, doesn't grant exceptions for men who own Rembrandts, and the grief that came after the Titanic revealed the fundamental emptiness of everything he'd built, the hollowness at the center of all that apparent solidity, because what good is a palace if the people you built it for are dead? What good is immortality through art if the dynasty ends before it can begin? What good is any of it if time and fate can simply erase your plans, mock your ambitions, reduce your life's work to rubble and ruin? Lynnewood Hall stands today, barely, precariously, held together by scaffolding and the efforts of preservationists who are racing against decay, as a monument to the limits of wealth, as a reminder that money cannot buy what matters most, cannot purchase immunity from tragedy or protection from time or guarantee that anything you build will outlast the purposes for which you built it. It stands as evidence of a society that valued the wrong things, that confused wealth with worth, that believed in a version of the American dream so toxic that it poisoned everything it touched, that created beauty through exploitation and called it culture, that built palaces on foundations of corruption and called it success, that accumulated art while ignoring the human costs of that accumulation, that measured greatness by the number of servants you employed rather than by how well you treated them, that thought legacy meant a big house and a name on a building rather than a world made better by your presence in it. And it stands, perhaps most importantly, as a warning about what happens when we organize our entire society around the pursuit of wealth, when we make money the measure of everything, when we allow a few people to accumulate resources that give them power over entire cities while millions struggle to survive, because the Gilded Age that created Lynnewood Hall didn't end, it just mutated, evolved, found new forms, and we're living in a second Gilded Age right now, an era of inequality as extreme as anything Peter Widener's generation created, an era where a handful of tech billionaires and hedge fund managers and real estate developers have wealth that dwarfs what the robber barons ever accumulated, where Amazon and Apple and Microsoft have more power than Standard Oil and US Steel ever dreamed of possessing, where we're building new palaces and accumulating new art collections and creating new dynasties and telling ourselves the same lies about merit and value and worth that they told themselves, and maybe, just maybe, if we're honest about what Lynnewood Hall actually represents, if we refuse to romanticize it or sentimentalize it or pretend it's just a beautiful old building rather than evidence of systematic injustice, maybe we can use it to ask ourselves the hard questions about our own era, about what we're building and why we're building it and what it costs and who pays the price. The ultimate irony of Lynnewood Hall, and perhaps the most important lesson it offers, is that the one unambiguously good thing the Widener family did, the one act that genuinely benefited humanity and that will last far longer than the mansion ever could, was giving away the art collection, was letting go of the thing Peter had spent decades accumulating, was transforming private wealth into public good, was acknowledging that trying to hold onto everything, trying to keep it all for yourself and your heirs in perpetuity, was a losing game, that the only way to create a lasting legacy was to give things away, to make them common property, to let them serve purposes larger than your own vanity or your own family's aggrandizement. Joseph Widener's donation of the collection to the National Gallery was an act of profound generosity, but it was also an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that his father's dream of dynastic permanence was dead, that the house and the art and the accumulated wealth of generations couldn't survive the twin forces of time and changing social values, that the best he could do was ensure that at least the art, the one thing of genuine value his family had possessed, would be preserved and made available to everyone rather than being dispersed to private collectors or destroyed by the inevitable dissolution of the family and its fortune. That donation is Peter Widener's real legacy, not the mansion falling apart in Elkins Park, not the streetcar empire long since obsolete, not the political machine that finally collapsed under its own corruption, but the paintings that hang in the National Gallery, the Rembrandts and Raphaels and Vermeers that millions of people have seen and studied and been moved by, the culture that was made common rather than being kept private. And if there's redemption in the Widener story, if there's anything worth salvaging from the wreckage of that family's ambitions, it's the lesson that the only immortality available to us is the immortality of giving things away, of making what we've accumulated available to others, of transforming private goods into public commons, of acknowledging that we are temporary but what we create can endure if we're willing to let go of it, to stop clinging to ownership and control and the illusion that we can take it with us or ensure that it stays in the family forever. Lynnewood Hall will probably never be restored to what it was, will never again be the immaculate palace that Peter Widener inhabited, will never again shine with the polish and precision that 100 servants once maintained, because we don't live in that world anymore, because the society that made such places possible has dissolved, because we've collectively decided, though perhaps not consciously, perhaps not deliberately, that houses like this are obscene, that 110 rooms for one family, while others live on the streets, is morally indefensible, that the concentration of wealth required to maintain such a place is itself a form of violence, a theft from the commons, a privatization of resources that should be shared, and so the best we can hope for is stabilization, preservation, interpretation, a building that tells its own story honestly, that refuses to glamorize the past or pretend that wealth and taste and culture are adequate justifications for exploitation and corruption, and the systematic denial of democratic rights. The Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation's vision, to make this a place of education and honest reckoning rather than celebration, is the right vision, the only vision that makes moral sense, because to restore the mansion to its original glory and then turn it into some kind of monument to Gilded Age excess would be to learn nothing from history, to repeat the same mistakes, to suggest that beauty and grandeur can excuse any amount of darkness in their foundations, and we can't afford that kind of blindness anymore, can't afford to pretend that the palaces of the wealthy are admirable rather than symptoms of a sick society, can't afford to memorialize robber barons without simultaneously acknowledging what they stole and from whom they stole it and what the costs of their stealing were and still are. In the end, what does Lynnewood Hall teach us? What lessons does this enormous decaying palace offer to anyone willing to listen, to anyone capable of seeing past the romance of ruins and the aesthetic appeal of abandoned grandeur? It teaches us that wealth is not security, that money cannot protect you from fate, that no amount of accumulated things can guarantee your children's safety or your legacy's permanence or your own significance in the grand scheme of things. It teaches us that beauty built on exploitation is always tainted, always compromised, always carrying within it the seeds of its own destruction, because beauty that comes from injustice cannot last, cannot sustain itself, cannot ultimately justify its existence no matter how spectacular it might be. It teaches us that the American dream as sold to us by people like Peter Widener is a lie, that the story of the self-made man who rises through hard work and determination is almost always actually a story about corruption and exploitation and the willingness to do things that other people won't do, things that shouldn't be done, things that should make us uncomfortable rather than inspiring us to emulation. It teaches us that legacy is not what you accumulate but what you give away, not what you build but what you share, not what you own but what you make common, and that the only immortality available to us is the immortality of our impact on others, of the ways we made the world better or worse through our presence in it, of whether we used whatever resources we had, money, time, talent, power, in service of the common good or in service of our own vanity and pride and hunger for acceptance. And it teaches us, perhaps most fundamentally, that everything ends, everything decays, everything falls apart eventually, that time is coming for every building we construct, every fortune we accumulate, every dynasty we attempt to establish, that the universe has infinite patience and will eventually reclaim every square inch of space we thought we owned, every resource we thought we controlled, every legacy we thought we'd secured, and that the only question that matters is not whether we'll be remembered but whether we deserve to be, not whether our buildings will stand but whether they should, not whether we were successful by the world's standards but whether we were good by any standard that actually matters. Lynnewood Hall sits on its 34 remaining acres in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, surrounded by the ordinary houses of ordinary people who live ordinary lives that will never be memorialized in mansions or museums, and it asks a question that we should all be asking ourselves every day: what are we building and why are we building it and what does it cost and who pays the price and will any of it matter when we're gone? Will any of it justify the resources we consumed and the opportunities we foreclosed and the alternatives we rejected in pursuit of our own private versions of immortality? The mansion has no answers, offers no comfort, promises no redemption, because it is itself the question made physical, the doubt rendered in stone, the uncertainty built into every room and every corridor and every empty space where something precious once was, and if we're wise we'll let it ask that question forever. We'll preserve it not as a monument to success but as a memorial to the failure of a certain kind of American dreaming. We'll use it to teach every future generation that wealth cannot buy what matters most, that money is not the measure of worth, that palaces fall and dynasties end and everything we build eventually returns to dust, and that the only legacy that lasts is the one measured not in marble and art and accumulated things but in love and generosity and the ways we made other people's lives better, easier, more bearable, more beautiful, and that if we can't do that, if we can only accumulate and display and protect what we've accumulated from the people who might benefit from it, then we have failed at the only task that really matters, the only purpose that gives human life its meaning, the only achievement that the universe might notice when it finally gets around to erasing our names and dissolving our works and reclaiming the space we thought we owned. And maybe that's the real dark story of Lynnewood Hall, the story that the mansion has been trying to tell through 6 decades of abandonment and decay, the story that we keep refusing to hear. Because it's too uncomfortable, too challenging, too much at odds with everything American capitalism teaches us about success and worth and the good life, that Peter Widener built his palace and filled it with treasures and lived like a king, and it meant nothing, absolutely nothing, because the things that mattered most, his son, his grandson, his happiness, his peace, his sense that his life had been worthwhile, slipped away from him anyway, drowned in cold Atlantic water or died of grief in empty rooms, and all that remains is this slowly crumbling monument to the ultimate futility of trying to build permanent things in an impermanent world, trying to own what can never be owned, trying to guarantee a future that no amount of wealth can secure, and the mansion will stand for as long as it stands, will eventually fall when it falls, and either way the story will be the same, will always be the same, because this is the story that wealth always tells if you listen long enough, if you follow it far enough, if you refuse the comfortable lies and insist on the uncomfortable truth, that in the end we all become ghosts in our own houses, that every palace eventually becomes a ruin, that the only wealth that matters is the wealth we give away, and that the only immortality available to us is the memory of whether we were, in the brief flicker of time we inhabited these bodies and walked this earth, kind or cruel, generous or grasping, human or merely rich.